Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. Power doesn't disappear when it's exposed. It disappears when people stop believing in it. Here's the part nobody tells you. Most power was never real to begin with. It was rented, borrowed, held together by agreement, repetition, and a crowd willing to nod along. The moment that agreement breaks, the whole structure collapses without a fight. No explosions, no dramatic downfall, just an awkward silence where authority used to be. And suddenly, the people who were loud about you go very quiet, not because they've changed, but because the spell stopped working. There's an uncomfortable fact most people don't like to admit. Social power thrives on participation, not truth. Studies on group behavior show that people will repeat a false narrative long after they privately doubt it, simply to avoid standing out. That's how influence survives, not through strength, but through compliance. Once compliance drops, even slightly, the loudest voices start sounding desperate. And desperation is never convincing. It's just noisy insecurity with better vocabulary. This is where it gets interesting. The moment people stopped buying into the hate surrounding you, something strange happened. Not to you, to them. The jokes landed flat. The warnings felt forced. The concern sounded rehearsed. What used to feel intimidating suddenly looked like bad acting in a low-budget drama that had way too many seasons. Same lines, same tone, zero impact. At some point, even the audience started checking their phones. And here's the quiet twist that makes it hard to unsee. When a person loses the ability to shape how others see you, they don't just lose influence, they lose identity. Because for some people, being against you was the job. It was the personality. It paid their emotional bills. So when that stopped working, they didn't just lose power, they lost direction. And nothing is more uncomfortable than someone realizing their role has been cancelled without notice. This isn't about revenge. It's about relevance. It's about what happens when a narrative expires. The crowd moves on, and the ones who lived off noise are left talking to themselves. And the funniest part? You didn't have to do anything dramatic. No speeches, no clapbacks, no grand announcement. The system shut itself down, and all that power they swore they had over you, it didn't get taken. It got refunded, with interest. Number 1. The narrative collapsed because it stopped being profitable. What most people call hatred is usually a business model wearing emotions. It survives on attention, reactions, and the feeling of influence. As long as talking about you gave people something to gain, validation, relevance, a sense of power, or even just entertainment, they kept the story alive. Not because it was true, but because it paid. The moment it stopped paying, it died. Profit doesn't always mean money. Sometimes it's social currency. Sometimes it's the thrill of being listened to. Sometimes it's the comfort of belonging to a group that agrees on who the villain is. You were useful to that system for a while. You gave them a shared enemy, a shared talking point, a shared excuse to feel superior. But once the returns dropped, the enthusiasm faded. That's how you know it was never personal. It was transactional. Over time, repeating the same narrative became embarrassing. The reactions got weaker. The audience stopped clapping. The energy shifted. People could feel they were pushing a story that no longer landed, and nothing drains confidence faster than realizing you're performing to an empty room. Hate without impact feels silly. Power without effect feels fake. And nobody wants to be the last person yelling when everyone else has moved on. What really ended it wasn't confrontation. It was diminishing returns. Each attempt to drag your name into something got less attention than the last. Each warning sounded more exaggerated. Each accusation required more effort to make it seem serious. When effort goes up and reward goes down, people quit. Quietly, without apology. This is the part that stings them the most. They didn't lose because they were exposed. They lost because they became irrelevant. Their words stopped shaping opinions. Their influence stopped moving people. And once that happens, the illusion of power collapses fast. No one announces it. It just becomes obvious. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. If tearing you down had still worked, they would still be doing it. The fact that they stopped isn't growth. It's economics. The narrative expired because it no longer produced results. And when something stops working, people abandon it, even if they swear it once mattered deeply. Number 2, you outgrew the version of you they were attacking. Most of the time, people attack who you were, not who you are. They latch onto a snapshot of you, a mistake, a weakness, a moment of vulnerability, and treat it like it defines the whole story. At first, it works because they're fighting an image, not a reality. That version of you is small enough to control, easy enough to shame, and simple enough to dismiss. But people change, you move forward, you evolve. And when that happens, their attacks stop landing the way they used to. Growth is invisible to the unobservant, but painfully obvious to anyone still trying to pin you down. They keep swinging at the old you, the version that made sense in the past, while you've already upgraded your thinking, your boundaries, and your presence. Their words, which once cut like knives, now bounce off a layer of confidence and clarity you didn't have before. They didn't realize that their power was borrowed from your compliance, from the version of you that still reacted to their noise. Once that compliance disappears, so does their leverage. It's not dramatic. There's no big reveal. They just start looking ridiculous. Friends, strangers, and even bystanders notice the mismatch, the way they keep yelling at someone who isn't listening, who isn't afraid, who isn't the same person they thought they could scare. Every attack becomes proof not of your weakness but of their stagnation. You've evolved past their comprehension, past their control. The old tactics fail because they were designed for someone you used to be, not the person you are now. And here's the subtle victory they rarely see. Growth doesn't need to announce itself. You don't have to prove anything, explain yourself, or defend your progress. You simply exist beyond the narrative they constructed. Their power fades naturally because the target they thought they had no longer exists. And the irony is brutal. The harder they try to hold on to the old story, the clearer it becomes that they've been left behind. You outgrew them. You didn't fight. You didn't argue. You simply became more than the version of you they could ever control. That's why silence feels louder than words in the aftermath. Because growth doesn't negotiate, it moves forward. Number 3. Their authority depended on repetition, not truth. Authority isn't magic. It's not some invisible crown you can wear and expect everyone to obey. Most of the time, what people call power is just a story repeated enough times that everyone starts believing it. The more someone says something, the more it feels true, even when it isn't. That's why repetition works better than reality. It's why the same claim, over and over, can make people feel guilty, scared, or impressed, even when there's nothing real behind it. The moment repetition stops, the illusion collapses. They relied on that. They weren't winning because they had facts, because logic, or because honesty was on their side. They were winning because they kept saying the same lines, painting the same picture, and making people nod along out of habit, fear, or the need to belong. Their power existed only in the cycle. Say it, hear it, believe it, repeat it. Break the cycle, and the house of cards falls. When their story stops landing, it's not that people suddenly see the truth, it's that people stop participating in the performance. Their audience begins to notice gaps, inconsistencies, or just plain tiredness from hearing the same narrative again and again. Repetition without results becomes exhausting, embarrassing, and ultimately irrelevant. The louder they get, the less weight their words carry. People don't even need to challenge them. They just stop listening. And the strangest part is how quickly the illusion unravels once repetition fails. Their confidence, which seemed untouchable, begins to wobble. Others start seeing the cracks. They realize the emperor isn't wearing clothes. And because authority was never built on substance, it disappears silently, almost invisibly, leaving the loudest voices looking ridiculous. The lesson is brutal. If your power depends entirely on being believed, being feared, or being repeated, it never belonged to you in the first place. It was borrowed. And the moment people stop echoing it, it vanishes, like smoke through fingers. That's why those who once had influence over you suddenly have none. The words they relied on to dominate lost their grip, and without repetition, authority dies quietly, leaving them staring at emptiness where control used to be. Number 4. You removed yourself from the audience economy. Power is a performance, and every performance needs an audience. The louder someone shouts, the more attention they get, the more relevance they feel. But all of that only works if people are watching, reacting, and participating. Once you step out of the spotlight they were counting on, their whole system begins to wobble. You don't even have to confront them or fight back. Simply stopping the supply of attention is enough to bankrupt their influence. They thrived because you, willingly or not, were giving them energy. Every reaction, every defense, every explanation was fuel for their narrative. It kept their story alive and their voice amplified. But when you stopped performing, when you stopped reacting, they were left talking into a vacuum. And nothing kills perceived power faster than silence. Their words, their accusations, their theatrics, all of it began to lose meaning because there was no one left validating it. This is why the so-called strongest voices crumble in the absence of an audience. Their confidence relies on the echo of other people agreeing, fearing, or being impressed. Remove that echo, and their castle of authority is built on thin air. They don't like to admit it, but once you stopped supplying reactions, you took away the very thing that made them feel powerful. The moment you became irrelevant to their economy of influence, their narrative started failing by default. And it isn't just about them losing control. It's about the subtle, almost invisible shift in the environment. Others start noticing the mismatch. They see the one who was supposed to be fearful now moving calmly, steadily, unaffected. They see the loudest voices struggling to maintain relevance while the target they were obsessed with has already moved on. That contrast exposes weakness in a way confrontation never could. When you remove yourself from their audience economy, you don't just survive. You make them collapse quietly under their own reliance on attention. Their power wasn't real. It was borrowed from your participation. And once you withdrew it, their influence didn't just weaken, it evaporated. The silence you created spoke louder than any argument ever could. Number 5. They realized you couldn't be controlled through shame. Shame is a powerful weapon, but only when the target still fears it. It's the tool of choice for those who need to control, because it plays on insecurities, past mistakes, and the need to fit in. The problem for them is that once you stop caring about shame, it loses its sting. What they used to think would break you, their insults, their criticisms, their attempts to make you feel less than, suddenly becomes meaningless. The irony is brutal. When they couldn't get under your skin, they realized just how fragile their control over you really was. Shame thrives in environments where people still care about the approval or rejection of others. But when you no longer seek validation from the people throwing stones, their attacks don't land. In fact, they look pathetic. The moment you stop needing them to validate your worth, they lose the most powerful tool they ever had. All those accusations, all those concerns, they suddenly become just noise. empty words with no power over you, and it frustrates them in ways they can't even explain. They know their go-to weapon doesn't work, but they don't know how to regain control without it. What's even worse for them is how invisible the change is. You don't have to announce that you're no longer affected. You don't have to defend yourself or explain your growth. You just stop playing their game. When you stop feeling shame, the power dynamic shifts without any confrontation. You don't need to argue or make a scene. You simply stop engaging with the emotions they were relying on to manipulate you. And when that happens, they're left without leverage. The cruelest part, they can't even admit to themselves that their power came from your weakness. The moment you stop being weak to them, they're exposed. They realize they weren't controlling you. They were controlling the version of you that still cared about their opinions. And once that version of you is gone, so is their influence. Number 6. The crowd noticed the inconsistency before you did. People love a story, especially one with clear heroes and villains. That's why manipulators rely on repetition, exaggeration, and selective facts, because the audience wants a narrative that makes sense, even if it's false. But no story can survive endless contradictions. The moment the narrative starts to wobble, the audience sees the cracks before anyone else does. They notice when the person spreading the story says one thing today and another tomorrow. They notice when warnings sound rehearsed, when outrage feels delayed, or when attacks no longer match reality. Inconsistency is a silent killer, and it works faster than confrontation ever could. The truth is, humans are wired to spot patterns. When something doesn't add up, it triggers doubt. It doesn't matter how loudly someone shouts or how many allies they gather. People can feel when the story no longer fits. And that's exactly what happened. While the manipulators kept trying to control the narrative, their contradictions became more visible than their points. People started questioning the reliability of the voice they once followed, noticing that what was painted as absolute truth was, in fact, shifting with convenience. This is why the crowd can collapse quietly, without any dramatic reveal. The audience doesn't have to confront the storyteller. They just stop participating. They stop clapping, stop sharing, stop defending. Their silence is louder than any argument. And the ones trying to maintain control feel it immediately, even if they can't put a finger on why. Their influence weakens because it's no longer credible. And the kicker is that they often don't even realize who caused the collapse. They see the crowd moving away and blame external factors, while the real reason is simple: inconsistency. The audience had already decided the narrative wasn't worth following. By the time you notice it, the power has already shifted. You didn't even have to act. Their story failed itself, and the people who once obeyed it quietly walked away, leaving the manipulators talking to thin air, powerless and exposed. Number 7. Your steadiness exposed their emotional instability. There's a hidden truth about those who try to control others. They are often unstable themselves. Their power relies on creating chaos, confusion, and emotional spikes, because the higher the reaction they provoke, the more control they feel. But when you remain steady, calm, and unshaken, that whole illusion collapses. Suddenly, their volatility looks ridiculous. The more they thrash and panic, the clearer it becomes that the one they're attacking isn't even participating in the storm. Your composure doesn't just shield you, it highlights their weakness in stark contrast. Emotional instability is contagious, but it only works if someone absorbs it. When you don't absorb it, you remove the fuel that makes the chaos meaningful. Their frantic attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or provoke fall flat, because your steadiness acts like a mirror, reflecting their overreactions for everyone to see. And people notice. Friends, observers, even passive bystanders can sense it. The louder they scream, the calmer you remain, the more exposed they become. That imbalance is more revealing than any argument or explanation could ever be. The beauty of this is that steadiness doesn't require effort. You don't have to fight back, explain yourself, or prove anything. You just exist without giving them the reaction they crave. And in doing so, you force them to confront their own lack of control. It's almost poetic. The one who thrived on destabilizing others is revealed as unstable themselves, and the target they tried to shake remains unmoved. There's a quiet power in being unshakable. It makes attacks look desperate, manipulations look childish, and threats look empty. Over time, even the most committed critics lose confidence because their tactics no longer work. You don't need to yell louder than they do. You just need to be steady, consistent, and unbothered. That steadiness doesn't just protect you, it dismantles the false authority they've been hiding behind. And the irony is brutal. The harder they try to provoke a reaction, the more their own instability is exposed and the less power they actually hold. Number 8. They lost access to your nervous system. Control is a chemical reaction long before it's a conversation. The people who once held power over you didn't rely on facts or reason. They relied on triggering your emotions, hijacking your fear, your guilt, your anxiety. They learned how to push the right buttons, how to get your heart racing, your stomach twisting, your mind spinning. That was their leverage. But the moment they no longer had that access, the moment they couldn't get under your skin, their control vanished. It isn't dramatic, it isn't loud, it's simple physics. Without a connection to the nervous system, influence dies. This is why silence feels louder than words. When you stop reacting, when your body and mind no longer respond to their provocations, they're effectively talking to a wall. Their attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or guilt you become ineffective, and in the absence of a reaction, their power evaporates. They don't realize it at first because they've been conditioned to assume that their attacks will always work. Every shouted insult, every subtle jab, every calculated rumor once had an immediate effect. When it stops, it breaks the illusion that they ever held authority. Losing access to your nervous system is more than self-control. It's liberation. It's the point where you realize that they were never powerful, only practiced at exploiting your responses. Without your emotional fuel, their strategy collapses. What once felt overwhelming now feels absurd. Every attempt to provoke is a reminder that their influence was never intrinsic. It was transactional, and the irony is brutal. They may still try, still act as if they have leverage, still look for the reaction that no longer comes. But all they're left with is noise. Their credibility erodes with each failed attempt. By the time they understand the change, it's too late. The nervous system they depended on to control you has gone dark, and with it, their so-called power disappears. It isn't taken. It isn't defeated. It simply stops existing because it was never real outside of your response. You became untouchable, not through conflict, but by removing the very connection that allowed them to matter. Number 9, their attacks began to reveal their own insecurities. When someone constantly targets you, it often says more about them than about you. Every insult, every rumor, every attempt to undermine is a reflection of the fears and weaknesses they carry. At first, it's subtle. The attacks feel pointed and personal, like a weapon aimed at you. But over time, patterns emerge. Their obsession, their intensity, their need to control the narrative begins to reveal cracks, the parts of themselves they can't face. Every exaggerated accusation, every desperate attempt to sway opinion is a window into their own insecurity. People who project hate relentlessly are often hiding deep self-doubt. Their power depends on keeping others small so they can feel bigger. But when that projection fails, when you stop reacting, when the audience no longer fuels their narrative, the mask starts slipping. Suddenly, what looked like authority or confidence is revealed as fear, envy, or inadequacy. Their attacks become less about you and more about them. Every word they throw is a confession in disguise, an accidental mirror of their own struggles. The beauty of this is in the contrast. While they're trying to control the perception of you, they're inadvertently broadcasting the state of themselves. People start noticing. The more they push, the more obvious it becomes that their outrage is performative, that their power is borrowed, and that their obsession with you is actually a reflection of their insecurity. And the irony is brutal. The harder they try to harm you, the clearer it becomes that they're the ones exposed. This is why emotional detachment is so powerful. You don't have to call out their flaws or confront their insecurities. By remaining unaffected, you allow their own actions to betray them. Their attacks, once intended to control or diminish, now serve as evidence of their weakness. The louder they get, the more they reveal the fragile foundation their authority was built on. In the end, their obsession with you becomes a self-portrait of inadequacy, and the power they thought they held over you quietly dissolves, leaving them exposed and hollow. Number 10. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. One of the most exhausting traps is trying to convince people who have already made up their minds. They don't want clarity. They don't want truth. They want a narrative that fits their version of reality. At first, it might feel necessary to respond, to clarify, to defend yourself, because their words sting, and you hope logic might work. But logic doesn't work when people aren't listening. It only works when they are willing to see. The moment you stop feeding their obsession, something powerful happens. Their control slips because they no longer have access to the reactions that once validated their narrative. Explaining yourself to someone determined to misunderstand is like throwing water into a sieve. No matter how clear, precise, or reasonable your words are, they filter through the biases, insecurities, and assumptions of the other person. And as long as you keep explaining, you're giving them relevance, emotional fuel, and a sense of power. Once you stop, you remove the energy that sustains their attacks. Silence becomes a weapon. Not your silence as a weakness, but your silence as a refusal to participate in a story that isn't yours. When you stop defending yourself, the narrative collapses quietly. People who were invested in controlling the perception of you find themselves talking to walls. Their arguments start to sound empty, their attacks repetitive, and their concern forced. The ones watching start to notice the pattern. The person they tried to dominate isn't dominated, and the ones who were once loud now look small and desperate. Their influence over opinions fades because the audience isn't being fed a show anymore. The brilliance of stepping out of this cycle is that you don't have to convince anyone. You simply live outside their story, and the story begins to unravel on its own. By refusing to explain yourself, you reclaim the narrative and show that control was never theirs to hold. Their power dies quietly, invisibly, without confrontation, because it depended entirely on your willingness to participate. Once that participation ends, so does their authority. Number 11. The power imbalance reversed without announcement. Power is a quiet, often invisible thing. It doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or confrontations. Sometimes it shifts silently, like a tide receding, leaving those who thought they ruled stranded. That's exactly what happens when someone who once held control over you suddenly realizes their influence has vanished. The imbalance flips, but no one makes a public statement. There's no declaration, no victory lap, just a subtle realignment that leaves the once dominant party scrambling to understand what happened. The people who thrived on having leverage over you relied on a system built on fear, attention, and reaction. They knew exactly which buttons to press to make you feel small, guilty, or reactive. But when you step out of that framework, when you stop responding to manipulation, stop feeding the narrative, stop giving your energy, the dynamic quietly reverses. The one who once had all the supposed power begins to appear desperate, obvious, and fragile. Every word they say, every action they take, starts to reveal their reliance on control that no longer exists. This reversal doesn't need dramatics. You don't have to prove a point, call them out, or issue any warning. Your calm, consistent presence is enough. By refusing to participate in the story they built around you, you shift the authority without anyone noticing the moment it happened. To outsiders, the contrast is clear. The person who was once aggressive, controlling, or loud now looks small, while the person who was targeted moves steadily, unaffected, and unshaken. That contrast speaks louder than any confrontation ever could, and the irony is merciless. They continue acting as if their power is intact, yet every effort they make to regain control only highlights the reversal. The harder they push, the weaker they look. The imbalance is no longer in their favor, and the truth is unmistakable to everyone watching. Authority was never permanent, and control only exists where energy and participation allow it. By stepping out of their cycle, you quietly reclaim the upper hand, leaving them exposed and powerless while you continue unaffected. Number 12. Others learned from how you handled it. Power isn't just about control, it's about influence. And influence doesn't always come from being loud or aggressive. Sometimes it comes from how you navigate attacks, manipulation, and false narratives with calm, unwavering clarity. When you respond with steadiness, when you refuse to feed the drama, when you refuse to let someone else define your value, people notice. Not the ones trying to hurt you, but the ones watching. They start to see the mechanics of power in action, and in observing, they learn. Handling situations with quiet strength sends a message louder than words. You don't need to engage in chaos to win. You don't need to retaliate to prove your worth. You simply exist beyond the noise, and by doing so, you redefine the rules of the game for anyone paying attention. Others see that reacting emotionally is optional, that giving control to someone else is unnecessary, and that self-possession can dismantle attacks more effectively than confrontation. Your behavior becomes a reference point, a model of resilience that teaches without teaching. The influence this creates is subtle, but unstoppable. It ripples outward. People who were once intimidated by manipulation begin to understand that their reactions are choices, not obligations. Observers begin to question the authority of those who thrive on drama. They recognize the difference between real power, rooted in self-control, awareness, and consistency, and borrowed power, which depends on provoking fear or anger. Watching you navigate attacks without collapsing becomes a lesson in autonomy, strategy, and psychological insight. And the ironic part is that you don't need to claim credit. You don't need to explain or instruct. The example is enough. Others internalize it simply by observing the way you exist beyond the influence of someone else's attempts to control you. Your strength teaches silently, demonstrating that power isn't given or taken through aggression. It's maintained through presence, integrity, and the refusal to let someone else's chaos dictate your reality. In this way, by simply being unshaken, you empower others to see and reclaim their own authority, long after the original attack has faded. Number 13. They couldn't replace you with another target. Some people build their identity around tearing others down. Their sense of power comes from picking someone apart, from having a consistent target to project onto, manipulate, or control. But what happens when that target no longer reacts, no longer feeds the narrative, no longer exists within the rules of their game? The machinery that sustained their influence grinds to a halt. They try to move on, find someone else to attack, but it doesn't work. You were unique, not because of who you were to them, but because of what they thought they could extract from you. No replacement can replicate that dynamic. It's not about your superiority or theirs failing in isolation. It's about fit. Their strategy relied on a specific combination of your reactions, your compliance, your energy. When that combination disappears, the formula no longer works. They throw themselves at new targets, trying to provoke, manipulate, or control, but the same tactics fall flat. The reason is simple. The leverage they had was never universal. It was specific, situational, and now gone. Their attempts to recreate it with someone else expose their dependence on you and reveal the fragility of the system they relied on. Meanwhile, the absence of reaction from you amplifies the effect. Others start noticing the mismatch. The one they obsessed over moves calmly, steadily, unaffected, while their attempts elsewhere look forced, desperate, and shallow. Every failed attempt reinforces the truth. Their power wasn't real. It was contingent on you. And the more they try to replace you, the clearer it becomes to everyone involved that their influence was borrowed, not earned. This inability to replace you is humiliating without drama. It's a quiet collapse. They can no longer recreate the same energy, the same reaction, or the same perceived dominance. The cycle they depended on is broken, and nothing can fix it. You weren't just resilient, you were irreplaceable in the context of their control. And that is why their power over you evaporated completely, because it depended entirely on your participation, and when that stopped, no substitute could restore it. Number 14. The hate ended because it never actually defined you. Hate has power only when it lands, only when it sticks. The people who tried to control you, manipulate your image, or spread negativity believed they could define you, reduce you, or make you someone they could label and dismiss. But you weren't confined to their narrative. You never let their opinions, their judgments, or their attempts to provoke determine who you are. And that's the cruelest truth for them. Their hate had no purchase because it was never relevant to your identity. When someone tries to define you through hate, they assume your sense of self is built from outside validation. They assume that if enough people echo their words, you will crumble, adjust, or conform. But the moment you stop internalizing their attacks, stop giving their words weight, stop allowing them to shape your reality, the entire system collapses. Hate is meaningless unless it is absorbed, and you refuse to absorb it. You remained anchored in your own values, your own perception, your own clarity. The attacks that were meant to wound now bounce harmlessly, revealing the weakness of those who launched them. What's remarkable is how this shift happens quietly. You don't have to fight, explain, or retaliate. You just exist outside the narrative, beyond the reach of their projections. Their noise continues, but it no longer resonates with anyone who matters. The more they try to cling to the idea that their words define you, the more obvious it becomes that they were never powerful in the first place. Their hate was a shadow without a body, trying to occupy space that you never ceded. And that's why the end of hate is absolute. It doesn't require confrontation, proof, or validation. It ends because it failed to touch the core of who you are. It ends because your identity isn't negotiable. They were betting on your reaction, your vulnerability, your participation. And when that never came, their entire foundation crumbled. The hate that once seemed relentless now disappears, not because they stopped, but because it never had the power to define you. It was always theirs, not yours. Conclusion. What we've explored here is the quiet, unstoppable truth about power, influence, and resilience. The people who tried to control you, manipulate your image, or define your worth were were never as powerful as they seemed. Their authority depended on borrowed energy, borrowed attention, and borrowed compliance. Every attack, every narrative, every attempt to provoke was effective only because you participated, only because you gave them access to your emotions, reactions, and vulnerabilities. Once that access was gone, once you refused to feed the chaos, their influence began to collapse quietly, almost invisibly. You outgrew the version of yourself they were attacking, exposing their instability and leaving their repeated stories hollow. You removed yourself from their audience economy, stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, and simply existed beyond the reach of their projections. With every calm reaction, every steady step forward, every refusal to absorb their attacks, you revealed that their power was never real. It was conditional, fragile, and entirely dependent on your engagement. And the most satisfying truth of all? Hate can never define someone who refuses to participate in it. Through this process, others watched, learned, and began to understand the true mechanics of strength, control, and self-possession. Your presence became a silent lesson in resilience. Meanwhile, the manipulators were left exposed, powerless, and unable to replicate what they once had with you. The narrative expired because it relied on a version of you that no longer existed, and the power they once claimed simply evaporated. This is a story of quiet victory, of influence reclaimed, of identity preserved. It proves that true power is never about tearing others down. It's about refusing to be controlled, refusing to be defined, and refusing to react to what doesn't matter. And when you live like this, you don't just survive attacks, you neutralize them, teach by example, and reclaim your space in a world full of noise. If this insight resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to see it. Your engagement fuels the truth, and together we rise above the noise. Stay awakened, chosen ones.